Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first installment of Rallyware's new webinar series. My name is Danny Josephson, Director of Revenue Behavior here at Rallyware, and today we're kicking things off with what I think is going to be one of the most important conversations in direct selling right now. The title of today's session is The 7-Day Advantage, and the premise is this. The industry has spent years optimizing for the first 90 days of distributor onboarding, and it turns out we may have been looking at the wrong window the whole time. I have two guests with me today who I think are the right people to have this conversation. Dan O'Mara leads our go-to-market strategy at Rallyware and has spent years studying the behavioral and economic patterns across distributed seller organizations. Also joined by Kristin Pfeil, who works directly with direct selling companies every day in discovery sessions, workshops, and conversations where companies are trying to figure out what's actually broken and what to do about it. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so really digging into one question. Why does the first 7 days matter more than anything else in the distributor lifecycle, and what can you do about it? So let's get into it. Dan, I want to start with the data because I think the numbers here are genuinely interesting. When we talk about how activating the right behaviors within 7 days predicts 2 times more lifetime sales than activating those same behaviors between days 8 and 90, help us understand what we're actually looking at here. What does that mean in practice for a company running a network of thousands or tens of thousands of distributors?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. And again, thanks everybody for joining the webinar today. I think really what it boils down to is we're not talking about the first 90 days is wrong by any means, right? It's what we've been operating with. There's a lot of proof that say, value in the first 90 days. We're going to talk about that here. But what I would say is that it's not wrong, it's incomplete. So if we were to break this down and we're talking about how does the first days impact lifetime value of a field member. So if we say, for example, somebody places an order within the first 0 to 7 days, or they're activated in the first 0 to 7 days. Well, if we look inside that cohort inside of the overall 90 days, we get a 2x lifetime value lift. So to break it down, somebody orders on day 2 versus somebody that orders on day 10. Day 2 is worth 2 times as much as day 10. But again, going back to the first 90 days, there's still a lot of value in that 90 days. Okay, because at that point in time, we're still talking about the fact that if they order on day 2 versus day 99, we are talking about a 6-time lift overall. But again, that we get that double that lift in that first 7 days compared to the norm of those first 90 days. So again, it's very important for us to understand what we are looking at here. First 90 days is still critical, but if we can advance activity in the first 7 days, then we are able to get a double lifetime value out of that. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that we see the same behavior in recruiting. So if we take a look at it and we say, hey, look, first from days 8 to day 90 in recruiting, if I recruit somebody in that period, okay, I have a 2.7 times lift in my lifetime recruiting. But again, if I look at that 0 to 7 days, I get to double that value as well. So again, we're seeing the same patterns hold true both in lifetime sales value, but also in lifetime recruiting, where if we can impact those first 7 days, we actually can double that initial cohort of that first 90 days. So again, the thought process here is that we're seeing this real compounding effect of those first 7 days. So again, 90 days are important. First 7 days, we're talking about doubling that value in that period of time. So if we're talking about large organizations, 50,000, 100,000, if we can increase those first 7 days by just a few percentage points, we're talking about a massive impact to the economics of the organization. And what we're looking at and what Rallyware has worked on and has done for such a long time is that we were answering this question, the strategic impact is no longer about, are we training better? Now it's going to be focused on how are we activating in that first week.
Thank you, Dan. And Kristin, you're in conversations with these companies every day. And when you tell them this initially, that 7 days is more predictive than 90, what's their reaction?
Hey, Danny. Um, as Dan said, thanks for having us. I'd love to answer this because it's actually really interesting. Most executives, they recognize it immediately because it's reflecting what they've already been observing in their top performers. So the surprise really isn't that early activation matters, but it's really how much it matters. Because once they see that lifetime value difference, the conversation starts shifting from how do we improve our onboarding to how do we consistently activate those behaviors of our top performers in that very first week? And then we do this across every new distributor. And this is actually a very different business conversation that we start having.
Amazing. And just a follow-up question there, what does a company typically look like when it comes to managing that first 7 day window today? What are you actually seeing on the ground?
Well, there's several things that I hear over and over again in the conversations that I'm having. Most companies, they don't have a 7-day activation system. What they have is they have an onboarding program. Well, their onboarding program is assuming that there's a sponsor or an upline or a team leader involved. And however, we see a lot of what we call the orphan problem, where 70% of new distributors, they don't have an active sponsor guiding them through those first critical days. They join, they receive a login, and then they're effectively left to figure it out all on their own. But yet I mentioned the onboarding model often assumes that somebody else is there helping them, providing them with structure and reinforcement. But unfortunately, it's just not happening. Second is what we call the one-stop shop problem. Most organizations, they've built a great onboarding resource center, but it's delivering the exact same experience to everyone, the same content, the same sequence, the same tools. And that's regardless of the market, regardless of their rank, or what that distributor may have done or may have not done. So it's really not activation, it's really just giving them some information. Third is what we call the we know what good looks like problem. Companies usually identify the behaviors that their strongest distributors complete in that first week, that first 7 days. But the challenge, it's not knowing what works, it's turning that knowledge into a repeatable, scalable system that activates those same behaviors consistently across the field. So the phrase I hear the most often is, we know what good looks like, we just can't scale it.
Yeah, and that gap, Kristen, knowing what good looks like but not being able to scale it, that's exactly where I want to take the conversation next, because I think there's a temptation to think of this as a training problem or a communications problem. Dan, what's your take on that?
Well, I would say is that we're looking at, say, more of a traditional view versus a modern day view. So traditionally, communications and training had one goal, and that was to drive activation of the field. Now we can have activation systems that purely drive activation. So we can kind of revert communications and training back to what they're supposed to do, keep people informed and inform them about our products and things like that. And then we put really less pressure on training and communications to be the leaders of activation.
Love that. And what we're seeing in our conversations with customers and potential customers is the investment in the industry is shifting from content and training towards this behavioral activation layer. So help us understand why that's the right shift and maybe what the economic argument for urgency would be.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Dan. So reality is that as we have stated above, faster results, initial results, and faster activation really do impact the lifetime value of the field. So faster systems then are going to deliver faster results. And so when the field, of course, sees those faster results, they're going to, of course, perform and stay with the company longer. And I'll get into that here just a little bit, is that that shift now knowing that activation is critical, that shift is moving from, okay, well, training content and training activities, which are still critically important, but they don't necessarily drive the activation that we want initially. So now what we're looking at is saying, okay, let's go to activation. And how does that really impact us? So reality is that productivity downstream is 7 times longer for early activators. Early recruiting behavior is actually also driven. So, when we are recruiting faster, we're also looking at long-term recruiting at being about a 10x ratio. Faster activation cohorts also show 81% better retention over 12 months. So again, why is this critical? And why is the urgency? Well, one is speed is the urgency. We need the field to generate faster actions so that they see the benefits of it, increases productivity downstream, like I said, by 7% or 7 times. And then also we're able to predict additional future revenue and predict future additional recruiting based on that. And so this is that compounding effect, driving those first 7 days, effectively driving what matters. And that's why these systems of next best action are absolutely critical here. And the companies that are ahead of that curve are actually going to see the benefits of it much faster and, of course, much longer as well. So that's what I would say is that companies that are focusing on next best action or really driving this activation of the field they're going to win.
Thank you, Dan. Really good insights there. And Kristin, when you're in a workshop with a company and they're trying to understand what behavioral activation in the first 7 days actually looks like, what do you typically walk them through out of the gates?
Well, Danny, what I typically do at the beginning is we have a shift in how they're defining their onboarding, because we've really moved away from what content should that new distributor complete. And instead, we want to start with what needs to happen in that very first 7 days for this person to build some real momentum. And then what we do is we start looking at the behaviors of their strongest distributors and what they're consistently completing early on, like that first meaningful action or the first order, or maybe their first customer outreach, and maybe an early recruiting conversation. And then from there, we start mapping the moments where momentum typically stalls. And then we ask, what signal could tell us that someone needs help? And then what's the next best action we want to make easy and really clear for them? So the goal in the end, it's not to create a longer onboarding journey. It's really to create a much more intentional one where the behaviors are prompted, reinforced, and visible. And we have to do that before that activation window starts to close.
I love that. And up on the screen here, I've got some actual milestones that we use as a starting point for that first 7-day window. Can you maybe dive a little bit deeper and walk us through each of these and also tell us, which ones companies consistently miss or overlook?
Sure. This is very important information. So if the first 7 days we know it's setting that distributor's trajectory, and if the operational gaps we just discussed are why companies tend to miss that window, the next question is specifically what needs to happen next. Well, this is where a lot of organizations, they overcomplicate the problem. Again, they're thinking in terms of completing an onboarding program. But the real objective, it's not content completion, it's that small number of revenue relevant behaviors that are creating that early momentum. And then when we're looking at distributors who go on to become productive, we consistently see 4 behavioral milestones in that first 7-day window. Milestone 1, it's that first meaningful action within the first 48 hours, like setting up a profile or product orientation, understanding the business opportunity, not just training completion, but actually taking an action. Milestone 2, first order within 7 days. This is the single strongest predictor because you cannot get to that second purchase without the first. And the second purchase, it's what defines a productive distributor. Milestone 3, first customer follow-up in 7 to 30 days. Now, this is the behavior that converts a distributor from a buyer to a seller. But unfortunately, most companies, they don't have a system in place that prompts or tracks this. And then lastly, milestone 4, that first recruiting conversation. This actually really surprises people because they're assuming that recruiting comes down the road, maybe a 30 to 90-day story. But we found that first week recruiters show 2.2 times more lifetime recruits. So this window definitely matters here too. So some things that some companies consistently miss are they're focusing on product knowledge, which is great, but they forget that using that knowledge to reach someone is really the behavior that matters. And then they just don't have a system to detect when that momentum starts to stall. And they find out 2 weeks later, and now it's too late to intervene. They're trying to scale people instead of scaling those important behaviors. And they're assuming if they build enough content or they're having enough communications that activation will just happen. But what we know is information does not create momentum. It's the behavior that does.
I love that, Kristen. A lot of really valuable information to digest there. I want to do something a little bit different here and turn the frame directly on the audience because I think one of the most valuable things you can do in a conversation like this is give everyone an honest diagnostic of maybe where they stand or maybe to get the wheels churning a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read these three questions directly to everyone watching, and I'd encourage you to answer them honestly, not for us, obviously, but for yourself. So question one, what percentage of new distributors place a first order within their first 7 days? Number two, how consistently do new distributors complete key onboarding behaviors across your entire field, not just the ones led by your best leaders? And question three, how quickly can your organization detect when a new distributor's activation momentum is stalling? And Dan, for the company sitting here thinking about these questions right now, what does it mean if maybe they don't have the answers or they're maybe unsure about that initial, response that comes to their mind?
Yeah. Good questions here. And I think one of the things we want to really think about is that first of all, if you are thinking about these questions, specifically question two and question three, first of all, congratulations to you on that. You are already ahead of the curve. But what I would say is in regards to this is that if you are wrestling with these questions, first of all, question one, most organizations should have this information. But if you don't, well, there's already a problem there that you guys have to go and try to figure out. But what I would say is that it all starts with that information around that data. Can you find that data? And two is that if you don't have that data, you really can't intervene before the windows close. So what I would say is that if you're wrestling with these questions right now and you don't have the answers, start with the data. Then you can move into understanding and setting up alerts or setting up situations where you can check on that data and then intervene before the window's closed. But the good thing is that kind of looking forward is that now that we have AI systems, behavioral data, we can now pinpoint which behaviors need to happen in the first 7 days and then whether they are actually happening in real time. And this will allow us to be able to intervene and be able to motivate and engage, bring leaders involved, really to work on that. So the question is, who builds that infrastructure first? Is it, are you working with organizations outside or are you working with inside your organization on that front? But that's what I would say. If you're wrestling with those questions and you're sitting with them right now, first of all, congrats. Second of all, follow the process. And actually the process works really well.
Amazing. Thank you, Dan. And Kristen, in your experience, what does it look like when a company is ahead of this curve? Like what's different about how they're thinking about onboarding versus the majority?
Well, the companies that I see that are really getting ahead of this, it's not necessarily based on their size or their annual revenue, but it's the ones who have really stopped treating onboarding as just a content delivery problem. They start by identifying those first week behaviors that their strongest distributors are completing, and then they're building a repeatable way to activate those behaviors for every new distributor, even those who do not have great sponsor support. What is different in how What is also different is how they're measuring success. They're not relying only on completion rates or 30-day reports, but they're actually looking at activation velocity, like how quickly does somebody take a meaningful first action, place a first order, reach out to a customer. And then they also have visibility into stalled momentum early enough to do something about it. Instead of discovering 2 weeks later that someone never got started, they recognize that gap and then they guide the next best action while that window is still open. And the experience adapts to what that distributor has actually done. Someone who already placed an order, they should not be receiving the exact same next step as somebody who hasn't even logged in since day one. So the end goal is not simply a more personalized onboarding experience. It's a more responsive system that keeps each distributor moving toward the behaviors that create that momentum.
I love that, Kristin. Thank you so much. And I want to zoom out for a second, and we touched on this a little bit, Dan, but everything we've talked about so far is specifically that first 7 days, but the implication is actually much bigger than that. So, Dan, my question for you is, if you get the first 7 days behaviors right, what does that actually change downstream? And conversely, what's the cost when those behaviors are not activated?
Yeah, Danny, thanks again. And I know we touched on this earlier, but I want to break this down into a kind of maybe saying, like, these should be the baselines. This is what we're looking at in these first 7 days. And I know, Danny, you're going to get into this a little bit later, but what's important here is that while we're going to talk about these metrics, these behaviors in this time frame, this is a repeatable process. Now we're talking about first 7 days, but this can be used in various parts of the organization. So again, we're going to dive into this right now, but I just want to think about it from the measuring capability and the ability for us to duplicate this process in other parts of the business, not just in the first 7 days. But think about it from a baseline standpoint. The compounding effect for this story is real. The first 7 days determine the trajectory of every stage that follows. And we'll break it down in this way: productivity. Distributors who hit early milestones sustain selling activities, again, 7 times longer. Recruiting, early recruiting behaviors predict long-term recruiting outcomes, again, upwards of 10x ratio. Again, I know Kristin mentioned this earlier. The first week isn't just onboarding, it's the seed of organizational growth. And again, that's what we talk about here in recruiting. Retention, another massive important milestone or indicator of our success, is fast acting cohorts show 81% better retention over the following 12 months. Again, very important. And if we think about these as the baseline, productivity, recruiting, and retention, then what we're able to do is to find out, hey, what is the cost if we don't actually have people hitting this information or hitting these numbers? So right now, you have the ability to go out and set these baselines, understand, and then you can actually do the economics yourself on, okay, if we improve this by 2 or 3 percentage points, what does this look like? How much could we have lost if we don't implement this now? So I would say starting the first 7 days makes the structure of the platform perform, and then we can duplicate this process in other places inside the business.
Super helpful, Dan. Thank you so much. And Kristin, I want to throw it over to you. If someone on this call wants to move on this, they're convinced, they see the window, they want to build a 7-day activation system, where do you recommend they actually start?
Great question. If they really want to build this 7-day activation system that we're talking about, I would say start with the data you already have. What percentage of your distributors place that first order in 7 days? If you don't know that, then that's step one, get that data. And then you map your top performers. You map their first week behaviors. Most companies, again, they have this data. They're just not using it as a design template. Well, then identify that orphan population that we talked about, the distributors without active sponsor support. They are your highest risk, but also your highest opportunity cohort. And then don't try to solve the whole life cycle at once. Pick the highest leverage behavior, like that first order placement, and then design a system around it to ensure that it's happening. What Rallyware offers is we offer a structured way to go from the we know what good looks like to we actually have a system that's replicating it. And that's what we call the behavioral revenue diagnostic. The companies that act on this now, they're not just improving their onboarding, they're actually building a competitive advantage in their field's productivity.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kristin. And in preparing for the webinar today, we were asking some of our current customers, like, hey, what are some of the questions that maybe you had when we started this process? And then we also looked at our conversations with potential customers to see what are the common themes that kind of surface through those initial conversations when we were talking about behavioral activation. So I have a few questions that I want to ask you guys. And but before I do that, do either of you have any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
I can go first here. My overall takeaway is that those first 7 days are not just an onboarding window. They are a revenue and lifetime value window. Most organizations, they already know what their successful distributors are doing early on, but the opportunity here is to make those behaviors happen consistently across the field, rather than just leaving them to chance or based on that their sponsors' availability. Because we do know that when early behavior becomes consistent, productivity, retention, and most importantly, revenue, they become much more predictable.
Love that. Dan, do you have anything you want to add? I think you may be on mute.
Gotta love it. So, best phrase around right now. So, and what I was saying is that the reality of the situation is that I think that Rallyware has always been pushing for this, and now we are really seeing the fruits of our labor. And it always comes back to this mindset. I wrote it down as we were talking. Is it all circles back to this, our main mindset, which is right action to the right person at the right time. And when we're doing that, and we're doing it properly, and we have the right windows that we're doing this in, the benefit to the companies are outstanding. So very, very important and very excited for that.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. So I've got just a couple questions. Kristin, this first one is for you. We've tried personalized onboarding before. It didn't stick. Why is this different? So what's your honest answer to that, Kristin?
Well, Danny, personalization, I mean, it's great. Everyone loves personalization, and it often means showing different content to different people, maybe at different times. But it's all about what they see, and it's not at all about what they're prompted to do. That's where the behavioral activation is different. It starts with the business outcome and what we're looking for. And then it asks what behavior needs to happen next for this distributor right now to achieve that business outcome. And then it reinforces that action. And this is based on what's actually happening with that distributor. It's not based on a fixed learning path. So that really, Danny, is the difference between personalizing information and actually orchestrating the behaviors that we're looking for.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Dan, this next question's for you. And I think everybody everywhere is talking about AI these days. So specifically, is this something that requires a major tech overhaul to implement, or can we work on top of what companies already have?
It's a great question, and it is a question that we're dealing with a lot right now. So what I would say is that it's not a tech overhaul. What I really say is that if you think about it, every company has their standard data. They've got inventory data, commerce data, ERP data. All of that data sits in different, places, whether it's, data lake or sitting in different, places. And what happens is that Rallyware sits on that data. And our prediction and AI capabilities read all of that data to then drive what we call the activation layer. So we use all of that data, sits on top of it, and And then that activation layer then is prompted by those, whatever those models may be, or whatever the system is prompting out. But whether it's like coaching prompts, next best actions, or even just pure notifications. All of that's through that, but no, it's not a tech overhaul. It's just simply just putting the Rallyware system right on top of all the current data.
Perfect. And Kristin, this next one is for you, specific to field leaders. I think we get some questions sometimes, if we systemize onboarding, are we cutting leaders out of the equation? Won't they push back? Maybe help us understand how that conversation has gone.
Yeah, great question, because we all know how important it is to keep your leaders happy. But we're actually seeing the exact opposite. The system is not replacing the leaders, it's actually making them better and making their lives easier. They love it because it multiplies their reach out without actually adding to their workload. Leaders get visibility into which of their downlines are stalling before they even have to ask. The system's handling those baseline activations like the nudges and the prompts or the reminders so that they can actually focus their attention on their distributors that actually need role coaching. So they're loving it. It's not about replacing them, it's about amplifying these leaders.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristin. And Dan, I've got one more question for you. When we start thinking about how do we measure this 7-day activation system? How do we know it's working? What are some of those initial KPIs that we should start thinking about or tracking to evolve and adapt the strategy?
Danny, thanks so much. When we started talking about 7-day activation, what we want to do is we want to find that initial North Star when we're measuring against it. So what I would say is one is that we can start with placing first order, which we've talked a lot about today, and even recruiting. When we start talking about actually measuring this, what a lot of our customers have done, and a lot of things that we've done in the past is when you're first rolling this out, you're going to have adopters, and you're going to have people that are adopting this and some that are not. And that's initially a really pretty much a good thing, because then we can start running cohort comparison. So we can start running A/B tests. We can start running AA tests, depending on how the structure is. But ultimately, what we're looking at is finding that North Star, and then being able to track that North Star, and then dividing everybody into different cohorts based upon their activation inside of that. Then as time goes, then we have our other baselines: retention, maybe first 90-day value, 120-day value, those type of things. But again, right out of the get-go, I'd say start with your North Star, which can either be recruiting or it can be that first order.
Amazing. Thank you, Dan. And we're at time here, so I want to leave you all something to kind of sit with. What Dan and Kristin are describing here is a structural shift in how most competitive direct selling organizations are going to operate over the next few years. The companies that figure out how to reliably activate distributors in those first 7 days, not because their leaders happen to be paying attention, but because they have a system, those companies are building a compounding advantage. Every new distributor who activates faster becomes a longer-term seller, a more consistent recruiter, and a more durable part of the network. And the companies that are still optimizing their 90-day onboarding program without looking directly at those first 7 days are playing the right game on the wrong timeline. So Dan and Kristin, thank you so much for such a great conversation. And everybody tuning in, please stay tuned, because episode 2 in our direct selling series is coming, and we're going to dive deep into the middle of the field, those distributors who are active, but maybe not growing, where a huge amount of revenue is sitting uncaptured. So thank you again, everyone, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.